Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Currently, recreational use of marijuana is legal in 24 states in the District of Columbia. 13 states from that bunch legalized marijuana through the ballot measure process, and 3 more will try to do the same this November, with initiatives set to be decided on in Florida, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We're set to see marijuana pop up in some way or another on ballots across the country, with 7 marijuana-related measures overall. But looming over all of these proposals is the prospect of marijuana being federally rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, which would radically change the landscape of related legislation and what's possible. We'll dive into the story of what federal rescheduling could mean for marijuana in the second half of our show with Vanderbilt's Mikos, who's one of the country's foremost experts on marijuana policy and federalism. So make sure you stay tuned for that. But first, I'm joined by Ballotpedia's own Nicole Fisher, a member of our ballot measures team, to take a closer look at these measures and what's happening across the country. Nicole, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
To start, would you mind giving our listeners an overview of how what we're seeing this year in terms of ballot measure activity compares to what we've seen in years prior?
Yeah, sure. So right now we have 6 confirmed measures in the ballot, marijuana-related ballot measures. We may have 7. So there's one currently in Arkansas that's going through the signature verification process. We may or may not see that, but we have 6 so far. The majority of them will be legalizing recreational marijuana. So previously, we mostly had marijuana measures legalized through the initiative process. So we usually had medical marijuana measures starting off in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and recreational marijuana first appeared on the ballot in 72. It was rejected in California. The first 6 recreational measures were rejected. The first 2 that were legalized, Colorado and Washington, happened in 2012. So after 2012, we started seeing recreational marijuana really take off and become more popular through the ballot initiative process. The legislative process sort of appeared later on. So in 2018, Vermont became the first state to legalize recreational marijuana through the legislative process. New Jersey in 2020 actually legalized the measure through a legislatively referred process, meaning that the state legislature, they placed the measure on the ballot for voters to approve. So it's not a citizen initiative effort, but the legislative effort. And the last couple of states that legalized marijuana, so Ohio did so in 2023 when voters approved issue 2. And the last state to legalize it through the legislature was actually Minnesota. So Governor Tim Walz signed it into law previously. So those were the last 2 states that legalized it, the recreational form.
Nice. And that's a great roundup of some of the marquee measures we've seen over the years. Obviously, it seems like the success rate has gone up over time. I actually didn't know that the first one, it was in 1972 in California. So that's pretty cool to learn. But what does the track record look like for these sorts of ballot measures? Do they typically pass or fail, or is it more of a mixed picture?
So it really depends on decade. When you started off, we had a lot more medical measures in the ballot. And medical measures were generally more popular and more accepted than recreational measures. So prior to 2012, like I said, the 6 recreational measures did fail. So California being the first one that failed, a number of them failed afterwards until 2012, where we saw the recreational measures approved in Colorado and Washington. So medical started off being the more popular choice, but we're seeing a lot more recreational measures on the ballot. So when we look 2012 onward, the 16 recreational measures passed while 7 failed. So 4 of those failures were in 2022 alone. So we had the Dakotas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma measures fail in 2022.
Well, that's a great roundup of what we've seen from the 70s up until now, about 50 years of history crammed into a quick summary there. So listeners, if you would like to learn more, you can check out the links in our show notes. Let's run through the ballot measures we're seeing across the country this year. Particularly, I'd like if we could start with the initiatives that are seeking to legalize marijuana for recreational use. We've got those in Florida, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Florida's initiative made headlines this last week when former President Donald Trump came out in support of that bill. So what would that bill do, and what sort of shot does it have at passing?
So Floridians will be deciding on Amendment 3 in November. So Amendment 3 would legalize recreational marijuana in the state for adults 21 and over. It'll also allow adults to possess up to 3 ounces of recreational marijuana. So former President Trump did come out to support the measure, which sort of puts him in opposition to Republicans in the state that came out against it. Florida Governor DeSantis opposes it. Senator Rick Scott opposes it. Representative Matt Gaetz opposes it. So does the Republican Party of Florida. They all oppose it. So that kind of creates an interesting dynamic where you have a number of Republicans and the Republican Party opposing the measure, whereas Trump supports it. So Floridians, they adopted medical marijuana in 2016. So that passed with a vote of 71% to 29%. This amendment will need a 60% supermajority to pass. So Florida established a supermajority requirement in 2006. It essentially means that you need more than 50% of voters to approve it. So in Florida, it's 60%. Polling-wise, when I look at recent polls, I see so far that 5 polls show it passing, 3 show it failing. The most recent poll by Emerson College shows it passing by 64%. Another recent poll back in August from, I think, Public Policy Polling shows it failing by 57%. So we kind of see a mixed bag as far as polling. But again, we've seen recreational marijuana measures generally pass more than fail. So it really depends on what voters decide in Florida. One thing I will actually add as well, what's interesting about Florida Amendment 3 is that previously the most expensive marijuana measure was in California. So Proposition 64 in 2016. That saw $27.14 million in contributions total. So $25 million from supporters, $2 million from opponents. So Florida Amendment 3 has broken a record so far with $105 million in contributions on both sides of the measure. So $90.4 million supporting and $14.6 million opposing. So most of the money coming in supporting the measure, a lot of it's from the cannabis industry. So Trulieve is the top donor. They contributed $82.7 million in support of the measure.
Wow.
So it's a very expensive measure. We have a lot of money on both sides of the fence supporting and opposing it. So that right now makes it the most expensive marijuana measure definitely on the ballot in all history of marijuana measures.
It's going to be super interesting to see what happens down there. We're going to be watching that really closely. How about out in North and South Dakota? I hope our listeners in North and South Dakota are okay with me lumping those two states together for this summary, but what's the story out there?
Yeah, so North Dakota will be deciding on Measure 5, South Dakota on Measure 29, and both of these measures will be deciding on recreational marijuana to legalize it. So each measure contains some regulations about limits of marijuana one could possess, etc. And both North and South Dakota, they both previously approved medical marijuana, whereas recreational marijuana actually has failed previously in both states by ballot measure. So North Dakota approved medical marijuana in 2016. South Dakota approved it in 2020. And when we look at recreational marijuana, it failed twice in North Dakota and once in South Dakota. But in South Dakota, they actually did previously legalize recreational marijuana in 2020. Voters did approve a measure to legalize it. However, the amendment was overturned by a circuit court for violating the single subject rule. So it was approved by voters, but then overturned by the court. And then voters again rejected a legalization measure in 2022, and it's back on the ballot now. So this will be the third time that voters will be deciding on recreational marijuana after approving it once and then rejecting it. So we'll see what happens in both Dakotas and see what happens there with Election Day.
Very interesting out there as well. And again, those are 3 of the ballot measures that will decide whether or not recreational marijuana will be introduced in those states. We're seeing a little bit of a different story over in Nebraska. And when I first read about these initiatives, I'll be honest with you, I was a little confused. I had thought since there was 2 of them, they might be in conflict or maybe trying to cancel each other out, something like that. But that's not what's going on, is it? How might those 2 Nebraska ballot measures work in unison if they're passed?
So essentially, the pair of these 2 measures in Nebraska would legalize a medical marijuana program. So Initiative 437, that'll legalize basically patients to possess up to 5 ounces of medical marijuana, so qualified patients. And for Initiative 438, this would basically enact the Medical Cannabis Regulation Act. So that would legalize possession, manufacturing, basically establishing the medical marijuana program. So you have one measure that will allow for possession and one measure that will allow for establishing a program across the board. So the pair of these measures will basically establish the medical marijuana program in the state. Right now, you have neither recreational or medical marijuana legal in Nebraska.
2 left for us to touch on, Nicole, and the one that has the most in common with what we're going to see in Nebraska is out of Arkansas. Again, I know you mentioned that ballot measure has not yet been approved to officially be on the ballot there. They're still awaiting signature verifications and making sure everything's in order there. But if it does make it on the ballot, how might their initiative expand medical marijuana access?
Yes, so medical marijuana was previously approved in Arkansas in 2016. So this allowed for 17 qualifying conditions to be approved for medical marijuana. It allowed for the establishment and regulation of medical dispensaries, etc. So this measure that may appear on the ballot will basically expand the medical marijuana program. And if it's approved by voters, it'll basically allow for medical marijuana patients to grow marijuana. It'll expand that list of medical conditions that will qualify for medical marijuana. It'll allow patient assessments through telemedicine and more. So it'll basically expand the current program that exists.
Last but not least, out in Oregon, marijuana is back on the ballot, albeit for a bit of a different reason than the others that we've covered so far. Oregon, as listeners probably already know, legalized medical marijuana back in 1998 and then legalized recreational use in 2018, both again via ballot measure. So what are advocates trying to accomplish with Oregon Measure 119?
So Measure 119, it'll basically require cannabis businesses to submit a signed labor peace agreement between the business and a labor organization. So it will basically help cannabis workers unionize. We have similar requirements for cannabis businesses currently in California, Connecticut, in New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. So it's basically just allowing for more of a bargaining rights, unionizing process for cannabis workers.
Nicole Fisher of our ballot measures team, thank you again. We always appreciate you coming on the show and keeping us up to speed with what's happening in the ballot measure world.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners, be sure to stay tuned. Again, we'll be right back with marijuana policy expert Robert Mikos for more on the prospect of federal rescheduling the drug and where both major presidential candidates stand on marijuana policy. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back on the ballot here. I'm Frank Vesta. Thanks for being with us. I'm joined now by Vanderbilt's Robert Mikos. Robert, thanks for coming back on the show. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
Yeah, it's been about a calendar year exactly almost since the last time you on. So it's great to have you back. I know it's a busy time of the year for you, so I'm glad we got some of your time.
Yeah, go figure. It's another election year.
Yeah, right. It's here again somehow. So we've heard a bit about the ballot measures. Voters across the country will have the chance to weigh in on this fall already with Nicole's help. But the major story related to marijuana snaking throughout all of this year might be the government deciding whether or not to federally reschedule the drug from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, also known as the CSA. Can you summarize the saga for us? You know, at the beginning of this year, it looked like rescheduling could have happened at any moment, but if I have it right, it still remains a Schedule 1 drug. So what's going on? What's brought us from 2022 when this was first proposed to now?
That's right. So the Controlled Substances Act, it calls for the government to the federal government to place any drug of abuse on one of 5 schedules. And that scheduling kind of determines how a drug is going to be regulated. So Schedule 1 drugs, those are the most tightly regulated drugs. They can only be possessed and used and produced and sold for research purposes. Drugs on the lower schedules 2 through 5, they can be accessed for treatment purposes, for medical use, and not just scientific research, and they're subject to progressively more lenient controls. So that's sort of the relevance of scheduling. And what's happened here is President Biden, sort of acting on a campaign promise he made 4 years ago, asked for the 2 federal agencies that are sort of in charge of scheduling drugs administratively, that's the Drug Enforcement Administration and Health and Human Services. He asked for those 2 agencies to go back and re-examine how marijuana is scheduled under federal law, because currently it's on Schedule 1, that most tightly controlled schedule. It's been there really since the CSA was passed by Congress back in 1970. And HHS takes the first crack at this. They're responsible for doing sort of a scientific analysis of a drug, trying to assess its abuse potential, its dependence liability, and whether it has, in the terms of the statute, a currently accepted medical use. So the ball got rolling back in October of 2022 when President Biden made this request. HHS in August of 2023, so last fall, word leaked out that they had completed their analysis and recommended to the Drug Enforcement Administration that it move marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That's ultimately the DEA's call. They're the one that's responsible for sort of changing the rules and changing the regulations. So the ball was over in the DEA's court. It didn't come out until January of this year. So January 2024, the reasoning behind that HHS recommendation. And the reasoning was, quite frankly, a little bit baffling. So historically, these two agencies have been on the same page. They've agreed about what tests you need to use to measure whether a drug has for example, a currently accepted medical use, what its abuse potential is, and so on. They've agreed on that. But all of a sudden, in January, when some documentation was released, sort of documenting HHS's reasoning on the rescheduling recommendation, came to light that they had done a 180. They had employed a very different set of tests to determine that marijuana doesn't belong in Schedule 1, but instead belongs on Schedule 3. And most relevantly, they basically said, well, in the past, HHS and DEA has equated currently accepted medical use, one of the key criteria, with kind of approval by the FDA. You've got to demonstrate through scientific research, randomized controlled trials, that a drug is effective at treating some medical indication. And that was always a stumbling block for marijuana because there were no RCTs, no randomized controlled trials demonstrating that it was effective at treating anything. There were lots of promising small-scale studies, lots of anecdotes suggesting, hey, it's useful for treating pain, it's useful for treating nausea associated with chemotherapy, but no RCTs. But what HHS did when it made its recommendation is it changed the test. It basically said, well, you no longer need that kind of gold standard science to support the efficacy of the drug. It's enough if a bunch of doctors are recommending it to patients and a bunch of states have approved it, as long as there's some credible science behind those recommendations. And interestingly, when HHS did this, in those 250 pages of documents that were released in January, it didn't seek to justify this new reliance on kind of physician practices and state law. It just announced this and said, hey, this is now good enough to demonstrate currently accepted medical use. And it was pretty clear that the DEA disagreed. The DEA wanted to adhere to that old test, wanted to wait until there were randomized controlled trials proving efficacy before moving marijuana off Schedule 1. So there was an interesting sort of internal disagreement within the Biden administration, two agencies not seeing eye to eye on the appropriate legal standard. Well, what happens in that situation is the Attorney General ultimately gets to decide. If you've got a legal dispute between two agencies, the Attorney General can step in. In fact, we got an opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel that basically said, DEA, you've got to follow what HHS did here. HHS made a reasonable interpretation of the statute. You can demonstrate currently accepted medical use through science, or you can demonstrate it through this other route, which is widespread state approval and widespread physician recommendations of it. And at that point, the DEA was obliged to kind of toe the line. So in May of this year, the DEA proposed a new rule that would move marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. It sought public comments on that. That's part of the administrative process. As you can imagine, it was deluged with comments, roughly 40,000 of them. The DEA, they're still not fully on board with this. They're still holding out hope that there's some way of not moving marijuana off Schedule 1. They continue to believe that that's where it belongs, at least under the governing legal standard. So they've kind of drawn out this process. They have to wade through these thousands of public comments. They've also said, hey, we're going to hold a hearing to hear more evidence about this. That's also part of the administrative process. But now that's not going to happen until after the election. And so you've got to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, go through all these procedural steps before you actually get a final effective rule that moves marijuana off Schedule 1. At the earliest, that's not going to happen until January, and who knows if it'll get done even by then. So it's been a longer process, I think, than most people anticipated, and also one that, interestingly, has kind of divided different elements of the Biden administration.
That's a great summary there for us, Robert. I appreciate that. And listeners, again, you can find out more about Robert's work at the link in our show notes. Let's think through some hypotheticals when it comes to ballot measures specifically. How might that landscape change once rescheduling takes place?
Yeah, so if the federal government were to move marijuana off Schedule 1 and onto Schedule 3, in theory, individuals could produce, sell, and possess marijuana, at least for medical purposes. And I think that could trickle down into the state level. It wouldn't necessarily automatically affect any states. The states have their own controlled substances laws. They don't necessarily follow the federal government's treatment of drugs in lockstep. I mean, obviously that's the case because we already have more than 38 states that have legalized marijuana for medical purposes. But this might add some momentum to those last holdout states that have not legalized marijuana. Because one argument that opponents have raised in those states is that, hey, this is federally illegal. The federal government doesn't see any value to this drug, and we should trust them. And we should wait until they actually deem it to have some medical value before we go ahead and approve it for medical purposes. So I think rescheduling at the least could kind of take that argument off the table or soften it somewhat, and therefore might pave the road for legalizing medical marijuana in those last, dwindling number of holdout states.
And Robert, I just wanted to clarify a finer point here. Does the scheduling of the drug have anything to do with the body of research needed and the body of research that's possible for more states to adopt medical use or even recreational use? How does that factor in?
Definitely. So drugs that are on Schedule 1, they can be used, and they can only be used for scientific research purposes. So basically clinical trials trying to test whether a drug is safe and effective at treating some medical condition. The problem is if a drug is already on Schedule 1, it's very difficult to conduct research on it. For example, in the case of marijuana, historically, the marijuana you used in your trial had to come from the sole provider that was licensed by the federal government. It was run by the University of Mississippi, and you had to accept whatever they sent you. You couldn't design your own marijuana product. You couldn't buy some marijuana product from some other source. You had to take whatever they would give you, and oftentimes the supplies given by that supplier were not up to par.
Can I jump in? Why was there only one? There was only one that was available?
Yes. So this was based on an old interpretation of international treaties where the DEA sort of incredibly claimed that international law, international drug control treaties required the United States to have one and only one supplier of Schedule 1 controlled substances used in medical research, like marijuana. That was a justification they gave. So Schedule 1, ironically, it impairs the very research that's required to move a drug off Schedule 1. And that's part of the reason why marijuana remains stuck there. It's part of the reason why a bunch of other drugs remain stuck there as well, psilocybin, MDMA, and so on. The same sort of restrictions apply to those Schedule 1 drugs as well. Although it's important to note that a couple of years ago, Congress actually passed a statute to expand research on marijuana and relax some of those controls. So if the DEA proceeds and goes ahead and moves marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it'll open the door a little bit more to research on the drug, but that door has already been opened a bit. So that's a little bit less necessary than it is for some other Schedule 1 drugs.
So the elephant in the room, Robert, as it always is we are now somehow less than 7 weeks away from the election. Let's take a look at both of our primary presidential candidates. And let's start with Vice President Kamala Harris, if you don't mind. Where does she stand on marijuana? What does her record suggest about how she might approach the issue once in office? And does her platform suggest anything about how she views both rescheduling and widespread adoption of the drug?
Yeah, I think her views on marijuana have evolved over the last 20 years or so. They've certainly softened over that time. I think she's always been the more liberal of the two candidates, and she remains so today on this particular issue. Recently, she has supported some federal legislation that would legalize marijuana at the federal level, both for adult use and medical use, while simultaneously kind of deferring to state law as well, allowing the states to do their own thing and be a little bit more restrictive if they want. So I think Harris fully supports rescheduling, which is now still pending before the DEA, but I think would go a step further at the federal level and push for adult use legalization as well. Although she, neither candidate has really made this a center point of their platform, has really emphasized it at all.
Got it. And then how about former President Donald Trump? He made some news, as I mentioned earlier in our episode, when he came out in support of Florida's ballot measure to legalize recreational use in the state. But what does his track record suggest, and does his platform say anything about how he would approach the issue?
Yeah, he's also suggested very recently that he's okay with rescheduling. Although it's important to note, just a few years ago when he was president, really his administration, it didn't crack down on marijuana, but certainly it was not supportive of reforms. And in fact, his first attorney general, Jeff Sessions, rescinded some guidance that the DOJ had issued that tried to provide some indication to the world, like, here are the cases where we'll actually enforce the federal marijuana ban. Here are the things we're worried about. He walked that back and, kind of left a lot of questions, even though he didn't actually launch a big wave of prosecutions. So I think Trump's recent statement suggests he's a little bit more open to reform. I think it's, maybe rescheduling at the federal level, although it's a tepid sport for that at best. He has supported the Florida, or come out and said he'd vote for the Florida legalization measure, but I don't think that also means that he would support adult use legalization at the federal level. Maybe he would support something like, hey, let's just take a hands-off approach, let the states do what they want to do, but we're going to leave the federal prohibition in place. So it's interesting that the divide between the two candidates is not as extreme as it has been in the past, and we actually get two candidates who seem at least open to reform. But I'd say between the two, Harris would pursue more aggressive reforms than would Trump.
Regardless of who comes into power in the new year, do you think that rescheduling will happen in 2025?
I would say, I'm 90% confident it's going to happen. I think this will be one of those things, it's called midnight rulemaking. I think it's something the Biden administration will try to get done before it leaves office. I think if Harris wins the presidential election, it'll stay rescheduled. I don't think there's any legal challenge that can be raised to rescheduling that I can anticipate. I think it would be tough to even mount such a challenge in the first instance. But I'd say I'm less confident if Trump wins, because a new administration could come in and quite easily undo any rescheduling rule promulgated in the waning days of the Biden administration. That might be subject to legal challenge, and the courts are less deferential today than they were a year ago, even towards administrative agencies. So maybe somebody could fight that, fight to keep marijuana on Schedule 3 rather than moving back to Schedule 1. So I'd say I'm 90% confident this is going to happen, but I'm less than 90% confident that it's going to stay on Schedule 3, and it kind of all hinges on the outcome of the November presidential election.
Super interesting and lots to watch here. Vanderbilt's Robert Mikos, thank you again for coming back on the show. We really appreciate your perspective and hope to have you back on soon, maybe in another year's time.
That sounds great, Frank.
Yep, and for our listeners, you can learn more about our ballot measure and marijuana policy coverage at the link in our show notes. Again, you can also check out some of Robert's work there as well. We'll be back early next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week.